much higher proportions of their income on rent. Housing experts say paying landlords more than 1/3 of wages on accommodation is unaffordable. The numbers of young people struggling with high rental costs is now said to be at a 5-year high. Here's our consumer affairs correspondent Coletta Smith.
The UK housing crisis has been described in many ways over the years: overheated, unaffordable, broken. But what's happening now feels different. This no longer looks like a market that's temporarily out of balance. It looks like a system entering a new, more dangerous phase. Rents keep rising, but outrage is fading. Homeownership drifts further out of reach, yet fewer people believe it will ever return. Families adapt, renters lower expectations, and instability becomes routine. That quiet acceptance is the real warning sign. When people stop expecting improvement, the crisis stops being temporary and starts becoming permanent. This is why so many are saying this can't continue, not as a slogan, but as a statement of fact. The housing system is operating without margin. There's no slack left to absorb shocks. Any change in interest rates, migration, or the economy now translates directly into displacement and stress. In this video, we break down why the UK housing crisis has entered a new phase, what makes it different from everything that came before, and why normal solutions are no longer working. Number 10. What the new phase looks like in practice. The new phase of the UK housing crisis is defined by normalization. What once felt temporary is now accepted as permanent. High rents are no longer shocking. Long waits are expected. Insecurity is built into everyday life. This phase is not about sudden collapse, but about the system quietly settling into dysfunction. Households adapt downward, lowering expectations rather than demanding change. Renting becomes lifelong. Overcrowding increases. Mobility shrinks. Crucially, this phase is harder to reverse because it lacks urgency. There is no single event to respond to, only slow erosion. When crisis becomes routine, political pressure fades even as damage deepens. That is why this phase is more dangerous than the last. It locks failure into place. Number 9. Why emergency measures no longer work. Previous responses relied on temporary fixes, short-term funding, small supply boosts, limited protections. In this new phase, those tools fail. Demand permanently exceeds supply, meaning relief is quickly absorbed. Any gain is temporary and local. Emergency thinking cannot solve structural shortage. Worse, repeated short-term fixes create fatigue and cynicism. People stop believing solutions are coming. Markets adjust around dysfunction, embedding high prices and low expectations. The longer this continues, the more radical any eventual correction must be. Emergency measures worked when the system had slack. That slack is gone. Without structural change, intervention simply delays visible failure rather than preventing it. Number 8. The shift from affordability to survival. The housing conversation has shifted from affordability to survival. It is no longer about whether housing is fairly priced, but whether people can stay housed at all. More households live one rent increase away from crisis. Savings disappear. Debt fills gaps. Informal arrangements increase, sofa surfing, overcrowding, delayed separations. This is a clear sign of systemic stress. When people prioritize staying housed over stability or progress, the system has entered a failure phase. Survival-based housing. Markets generate long-term damage. Worse health outcomes, lower productivity, and reduced social mobility. Once survival becomes the baseline, recovery becomes far more complex. Number 7. How renting became a permanent condition. Renting was once transitional. In the new phase, it is permanent. Ownership is increasingly restricted to those with inheritance or exceptional income. This shifts housing from a ladder to a ceiling. Long-term, renting without security reshapes behavior. People avoid risk, delay families, and stay in unsuitable jobs. Communities become transient. Investment in place declines. The psychological impact is profound. When housing offers no future, people stop planning long-term lives locally. Permanent renting is not inherently bad, but permanent insecurity is. The UK has combined lifelong renting with short tenancies and volatile prices, the worst possible combination. That contradiction defines this new phase. Number 6. Supply failure is now locked in. In earlier phases, housing shortages were treated as solvable with time. That is no longer true. Planning, delays, high build costs, land constraints, and political resistance mean supply failure is now baked in for years. Even aggressive building would take a decade to rebalance the market. This means pressure is not easing, it is guaranteed. Markets price this in, pushing rents higher and expectations lower. When shortages become structural rather than cyclical, behavior changes permanently. Investors adapt. Renters absorb pressure. Policymakers lose room to maneuver. Locked-in supply failure is the backbone of this new phase. Number 5. The middle is now under housing stress. The defining change in this phase is who is affected. Housing stress has moved decisively into the phase. Middle. Professionals with stable jobs now struggle with rent, deposits, and security. This marks a tipping point. When middle-income households feel trapped, political and social consequences follow. These are not marginal cases. They are the backbone of the workforce. Their frustration is quieter but more destabilizing. They cut spending, delay children, and consider leaving high-cost areas or the country entirely. Once housing stress reaches the middle, it no longer resolves itself quietly. It reshapes demographics, labor markets, and growth. Number 4. Public services are absorbing the fallout. Housing failure spills directly into public services. Councils face rising homelessness costs. Temporary accommodation becomes long-term. Health services absorb the stress of poor housing conditions. Schools deal with instability and displacement. These systems are not designed to compensate for market failure at scale. As housing pressure rises, public services quietly take on the burden until they, too, strain. This creates a feedback loop. Weaker services make areas less livable, pushing housing pressure elsewhere. The housing crisis is no longer contained within the housing market. It is infecting the entire public system. Number 3. Mobility is collapsing. Housing cost is now the primary barrier to mobility. People cannot move to where jobs are because rents erase wage gains. This freezes labor markets and reduces productivity. Workers stay put, not because jobs are good, but because moving is unaffordable. This damages growth quietly but persistently. Cities lose essential workers. Regions stagnate. Opportunity becomes geographically locked. When mobility collapses, inequality hardens. The UK's housing crisis is no longer just about shelter. It is restricting economic movement. That makes this phase fundamentally different and far more damaging than earlier. Affordability debates. Number 2. Why this can't continue is no longer rhetoric. This can't continue is no longer emotional language, it is literal. Systems operating without margin eventually fail. The housing market has no buffer left. Any shock interest rates, migration changes, economic slowdown translates directly into displacement and stress. People sense this intuitively. That is why resignation is replacing outrage. When crisis becomes permanent, resistance fades. That silence is dangerous. It allows dysfunction to harden into the new normal. Saying this can't continue now reflects inevitability, not protest. The question is no longer whether change is needed, but whether it comes by design or by breakdown. Number 1. Why the housing crisis has entered a new phase. The UK housing crisis has entered a new phase because pressure has become permanent, widespread, and normalized. Earlier phases were defined by shock rising prices, sudden shortages, visible pain. This phase is defined by adaptation to failure. People expect instability. Markets price in dysfunction. Policymakers manage symptoms rather than causes. That is the hallmark of a system past its limits. When a crisis no longer triggers urgency, it stops being temporary. This phase will not resolve itself. Without structural change, it will deepen quietly, reshaping how people live, work, and plan their futures. That is why this moment matters more than any headline spike before it.